Hello, my name is Zachary Fillingham and I'm the lead analyst at Geopolitical Monitor. In this analysis video, I'm going to be discussing a recent article we published on the website examining Canadian defense spending. This piece explores the current state of the Canadian military, along with shifting security perceptions among Canadian voters, Ottawa, and NATO allies. Finally, it answers the million-dollar question of whether or not Canada has any hope of meeting its spending obligations under NATO. I'm going to delve into some of these issues in this analysis video, but for a more in-depth examination, I invite our subscribers to have a look at the original article. You will find it in the video description. So first and foremost, what are the NATO spending obligations? This refers to two spending pledges that were both adopted at the Alliance's Wales Summit in 2014. The first is that member states spend 2% of their GDP on defense spending. Incidentally, in the post-Ukraine war context, NATO leaders have been stressing that this 2% must be viewed as a floor rather than a ceiling. And in addition to the 2%, NATO member states must spend at least 20% of their defense budget on equipment, either modernizing old stocks or procuring new ones. This helps ensure that defense spending is going into productive operational capacity and not being gobbled up by lumbering bureaucracies or civil servant pensions. Canada has the unfortunate distinction of being only one of two NATO members that is actually non-compliant with regard to both of these spending obligations. This isn't altogether surprising, though, when you look at the post-Cold War history of the Canadian Armed Forces. From the early 1990s onward, Canada's military has been slowly dismantled by successive federal governments, both liberal and conservative. In 2014, military spending to GDP hit a historical low of 1%. The decline was further compounded by staffing cuts that rendered the procurement system wholly dysfunctional. A perfect example of how this combination of political neglect and bureaucratic inefficiency played out is the Sea King helicopter affair. This is a procurement saga that spanned nearly 30 years and involved hundreds of millions of wasted tax dollars and canceled contracts. Fast forward now to 2024, and internal D&D reports have warned that only 58% of the CAF would be able to respond in the event of a crisis. And almost half of all Canadian military equipment is currently considered unavailable and unserviceable. This long-term neglect of the Department of National Defence looms large over any renewal effort in Canadian defence policy. It reverberates first and foremost with regard to political credibility, as cynicism is the conditioned response of Canadian voters whenever a bold new defense plan is announced, calling for years of new spending. In the past, these bold plans have tended to fade into oblivion as other political priorities eventually take over, contributing to a gradual decline of the Canadian Armed Forces. But that was then. Now we are seeing sweeping change and mounting great power competition in global politics. These shifts are altering the threat perceptions of the voting public and in turn, political priorities in Ottawa. They're also giving rise to external diplomatic pressure from allies for Canada to quote-unquote pull its weight in NATO. Taken together, these trends hint at a paradigm shift in the making, one where Canada actually carves out a path to compliance in its NATO defense spending targets, eventually. So probably the most important changes are taking place on the ground level, and this is the fact that Canadian attitudes are changing. Two polls are cited in the article. First is a 2024 Angus Reid survey that found that 29% of Canadians view military preparedness and Canada's global position as a top political priority, up from just 12% a decade ago. Second, some 53% of voters now support meeting Canada's spending goals under NATO. And under the hypothetical of a second Trump presidency, this number jumps to 65% of voters. These levels of support are noteworthy because they run contrary to the strong historical headwinds of viewing Canada as a, quote, fireproof house far removed from flammable materials, end quote, in the famous words of Liberal politician Raoul Dandurand in a 1924 speech. Put simply, Canada has long benefited from its favorable geography. The country is bordered by 3 oceans, only 2 of them safely navigable up until now, and a friendly superpower to the south. This perceived sense of safety and security has contributed to the long-term neglect of the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly in the post-Cold War period. It stands in stark contrast to a country like Australia, which inhabits a much more dangerous neighborhood and cannot solely rely on U.S. security guarantees. Incidentally, Canberra already spends about 2% of its GDP on defense spending, despite not being a member of NATO, and this level is expected to reach 2.4% by 2033. Evolving threat perceptions are being reflected in federal policy as well. The Trudeau government revealed its new defense policy, entitled Our North, Strong and Free, in April. The world that it envisions is much changed from the post-Cold War reality, and the policy notes several new threats that can encroach on Canada's fireproof house. Notably, climate change is stressed as a major threat vector, one that will demand new capacities to meet the challenge of natural disasters and mass migration. Climate change is also expected to gradually open up the Arctic to global shipping, putting Canada in direct competition with Russia and China to use it or lose it with regard to its sovereignty across vast stretches of territory in the north. Our North, Strong and Free goes on to identify state collapse, a fracturing post-Cold War global order, and great power competition in Europe and the Indo-Pacific as other trends behind a deterioration of Canada's threat environment. Unsurprisingly, these threats call for a hefty shopping list of new military equipment, including the purchase of assault and surveillance drones, new logistical infrastructure in the north, revamping Canada's submarine fleet, and acquiring modern tactical helicopters, just to name a few. And though the Trudeau government has announced an additional $8.1 billion in spending over 5 years to complement the policy, as always with Canadian defense spending, we don't know for sure until the money is actually spent. Shifting attitudes and behavior from Canada's NATO allies will also help prop up Canadian defense spending in the near term. As you can see from the graph, an activist Trump administration and the first European land war since World War II have combined to move defense spending up the list of priorities for all NATO member states. The trend since 2014 is stark, as no fewer than 20 NATO members have crossed the 2% threshold in the past decade, leaving Canada to languish in a rapidly shrinking club of non-compliant members. This in effect places a spotlight on the Trudeau administration and no doubt contributed to its post-summit pledges to reach the 2% target by 2032. In the event of a second Trump administration, the spotlight is only going to get brighter. Taken together, this all points to a long-term trend of higher defense spending levels in Canada. And to be fair, this was already playing out, as defense spending to GDP has increased from sub 1% levels in 2014 to 1.33% in 2024. Altered threat perceptions are building a floor under defense spending levels where once there was only political quicksand. Yet overly optimistic outlooks of a revival in the CAF should be tempered by two realities. One, the CAF is operating at a severe deficit following decades of neglect, and new funding needs to fill these holes before the new capacities envisioned in Our North, Strong and Free can be realized. And two, fiscal pressures and uncertain growth outlooks will go far in delineating what is politically possible in the near future. In this, it's interesting that opposition leader Pierre Poilievre refused to commit to the 2032 timeline, citing budgetary pressures, despite Prime Minister Trudeau capitulating on the matter at the NATO summit in early July. Alright, well, that about wraps up this analysis video. Thank you kindly for listening, and it would be wonderful if you could like and subscribe. The article on the website explores these issues in greater detail, so feel free to click on the link in the description for a more in-depth look into Canada's path to 2%. Once again, thanks for listening and have a wonderful day.